Hello, hi everybody. Welcome aboard to History 241, Civilizations of Asia. My name is Abdul Karim Khan. I'm an associate professor here at Leeward Community College, teaching world civilizations and Asian civilizations and sometimes history of the Middle East. And now on TV, I need to give you a few housekeeping tips, what to do with the course assignments and especially with the course outline. You can download from WebCT all the material that you have to worry about, and the chapters, the what sessions we're going to be following, and what would be the assignments, what are the required ones and what are not the so much required ones. So please go to WebCT and look under my name, and especially for History 241, Civilizations of Asia at Leeward Community College. You could email me at khana@hawaii.edu, that is khana@hawaii.edu. It's on the TV and on your WebCT. So please pay close attention to the requirements and the housekeeping that we have for History 241, Civilizations of Asia. One more thing about the course assignments, that would be if you could please email me also your phone numbers so that I could, if I need to call you or contact you, I would have something, to readily alert you to some of the changes that might be coming. And so that's how we would keep communications. Whenever you email me, please email me from your hawaii.edu email address. And that's how it's very easy to find you through the WebCT. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult. So please, whenever you email me from your hawaii.edu account. That is one. Number two, when you email me, write in the subject slot that you are from my History 241 class. So that's how I would know who is on the email. Now, History 241, the civilizations of Asia. Let's see what is there for you and what are some of the learning objectives in this class, what you are going to be learning. A lot of exciting stuff that we're going to go into. First of all, this is a history class and a history course, and so I'm going to talk about what is history itself, some of the problems of definitions, and how history, geography, and cultures are made and how they are interconnected. So some of the learning objectives in this class would be civilizations of Asia, how they came about, Asian history, especially in its geographical, socioeconomic, and cultural context, and how the geography, the society, the economics, and the cultures, they work together to make civilizations. So some of those things we would talk about. We would also focus on the geography of Asia, although it's not a Geography 101 class, but still it's great to know the geography of the places and the people of whose history, cultures, and civilization we learn. So geography is very important. So pay close attention to the maps that you might have in the book, or you could have your own map, mental map, or somewhere in the house, a map of Asia. So South Asia is one big theme that we are going to be talking about in history. East Asia is another big theme that we would learn in this class. So for the geography is concerned, and Southeast Asia we would focus. So basically we are going to focus in this Asian civilization class on South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, and in a minute we would go into what are these different regions. It's very common for people to talk about Asia, and when they say Asia, they mean China, Japan, and Korea. So let's be clear on this, that Asia is a huge big continent with a lot of, huge big size and a lot of people, very diverse people, and so it's good to know what parts of Asia we're talking about. So that's why we would focus for this class and this course. The purpose of this course is to focus and talk more about South Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia. However, there is another Asia called Central Asia. And Central Asia, although our course does not have much about Central Asia, but given the time as we have, and if we have more time, we can get into the Central Asian. So please keep in mind the different regions of Asia: South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, that would be under our focus. Now, when it comes to the geography of Asia, as I said, it's a huge, big place. There on the screen you can see the world map, and of the world, on the right hand corner you see the colored area. That is Asia, the huge, big continent of Asia, and it has, as I said, different parts. One part of it is South Asia, which constitute the countries of Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. So that's one big part of Asia with huge, big population in the world. There's another part of Asia called East Asia, and it has China. We go alphabetically: China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, North and South Korea, and Mongolia. They constitute East Asia. Southeast Asia. Why Southeast Asia is called Southeast Asia? Because it is to the south of China and to the east of India. That is the reason it's called Southeast Asia. It might be a little bit confusing, but as we go into it, then we would take care of that. Let's see some of the countries of Southeast Asia. That would be Brunei, Cambodia, East Timor, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, which was previously known as Burma, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. It's a huge, big, again, population also. So these were the countries of Southeast Asia. Now, Central Asia. For that, I have only a sort of a clue. Any country, with the exception of Pakistan, any country that ends at Stan, S-T-A-N, that is a Central Asian country. Stan, S-T-A-N, not Stan, but Stan, in Persian it means the land. So, for example, Afghanistan. Afghanistan means the land of the Afghan people. So there are two terms, Afghan and Stan, and each term refers to the ethnicity of the people, like Afghanistan, the land or the country of the Afghan people; Kazakhstan, the land or the country of the Kazakh people; similarly Kyrgyzstan, the land of the Kyrgyz people; Tajikistan, the land of the Tajik people. It's an ethnic group, linguistic group also. Turkmenistan, the land of the Turkmen; Uzbekistan, the land of the Uzbek people. And as you see, there are so many people, and in different parts of Asia. So we would talk about all these great places and great people, but unfortunately we may not have so much time for the Central Asian countries, although my expertise is much more in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But if we have time, definitely we will talk about Afghanistan, which is so much, especially these days, so much in the news. So we talk about the history and geography and the culture of Afghanistan. Now, I'm sort of giving you introduction that what are some of the subjects that we're going to be touching upon in terms of the learning objects, what we are going to be learning in this class. Since this is primarily a history class, History 241, history of the civilizations of Asia. So that's why we are going to be talking about a lot of history. Not only just history, but also society, economics, culture, civilizations, peoples, and different places. So for the history of Asia is concerned, We would focus on the prehistoric times, that is the times before writing was discovered in Asia. We would talk about ancient times and medieval times and the history of those periods, prehistoric, ancient, and medieval history. And we would start from the earliest times, that is the beginning of the early human beings, how human beings emerged in Asia and how they created their cultures, their civilizations, and we would go from the earliest times to the 1500. 1500 sort of a convenient space or period to break history 241. And from 1500 onward to the present time is the period which is the subject matter of history 242. So we would stop at 1500 in history in history 241, and we would start from 1500 in history 242. So one deals with the previous period before the modern times, before 1500, and the other deals with the modern times after 1500. 1500 is a convenient, as I said, is a convenient period or year that is much more used when the Europeans came to Asia and start sort of interaction with the Asian people, different Asian people, with the people of India, China, Japan, and Korea. So that's the reason we stop at 1500 before the coming of Europeans in history 241. And in history 242 we would start from 1500 and we would go on. Now we would also talk about the socio-economic conditions of Asia or Asian civilizations. We would talk about agriculture, how much Asia is about agriculture and how agriculture had its own impact upon the people of Asia. Some of it, good a lot of it is good rather, in the sense that Asia was mainly an area or civilization of food production. Also, when it comes to agriculture production, how some of this agriculture and the surplus agriculture went into trade and traveling and into business. So from the agricultural economy we would go into the business and the traveling and the trading economy. When it comes to the socioeconomic conditions, there we would focus on the socioeconomic classes as well. The lower class people, the high class people, different caste and different classes, basically socioeconomic classes, and how these socioeconomic classes are fed into the religious or the political system of Asia. So keep in mind the socioeconomic classes and their significance, how the family, the tribe, the clans, and the caste work themselves into the socioeconomic system of Asia. Since it's a class in culture and civilizations of Asia, we would also talk about what is culture or what is a civilization. What are some of the similarities and some of the differences? So most of the time what happens, whether in terms of the Asian civilization or in terms of the African civilization or European civilization or any other place, a lot of people, when they say culture, by culture they mean civilization, and when they say civilization they mean culture, as if the two terms are very interchangeable. Yes, they are. But there are a lot of subtle and obvious differences between the two. So we would talk about what is culture, what is civilization, what are some of the similarities and the differences between the two of them. Now, in this class, we would also talk about the religions of Asia, and we would focus on primarily the big religions of Asia. And as you might know, Asia is the only continent, if we can call it that way, or the only place or the only civilization that produced all major religions in the world. Any major religion that you know had its original home place or birthplace in Asia. like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. These were born in India primarily, but these are not the only ones that were born in, in Asia. There were other religions that were born. So one more time, any major religion that you know, whether you are aware of not, well, that's or not, that's a different issue. But all major religions, including Judaism and Christianity, these were born in Asian places. And I say that because like Islam and Judaism and Christianity, they were born in the Middle East. And Middle East is part of Asia. It's called Southwestern Asia, but unfortunately that does not fall into our own conventional, the geography in which we trace the history of Asian civilizations and the in History 241 course. So one more time, we're going to be focusing on religions, different religions, Confucianism, Taoism, and Shinto religions, which are the religions in basically East Asia, China, Japan, and Korea. Also, we would talk about Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and how these three major religions of the world came to Asia, although all three were born, as I said, in the Middle East, and just at a small distance from each other. Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and how these religions came to Asia and the impact that they had in their own ways on different people of Asia. Compared to Christianity and Judaism, Islam in fact became the predominant religion in Asia. So we would talk about the major religions in Asia, and from there we would move on to the main topic of today, what is history? And it's different people would answer it different way, and I encourage you to write about and you talk about in your own way, what does it mean to you personally, as a particular person coming from a particular ethnicity or linguistic group or race or religion. What is it that history stands for you? That is one way to look at it, from a sort of a narrow way. Another one, and I encourage you to do that, look at history from a human point of view. Whatever our colors, whatever our creeds, and whatever our countries and continents that we might be coming from, there is a major factor and a bigger factor, and that is we are all human beings. And so no need to say that, but still to remind people that first and foremost we are all human beings, and then we have different regions and come from different religions, and we belong to different races, but primarily first and foremost we are human beings, and that's what we should be focusing on, our own humanity, and put ourselves in other people's shoes, and that we can do it only when we think of them as human beings. So when it comes to history, you answer that question in your own way, in your own geographical, social, economic, or racial and religious or regional context. So think about it, what is history and what it means to you. Some people might say, if you have any answers, that's, definitely you have your own answers, but I encourage you to think deeply what history is and what it means to you. For most people, history is the record of past events, and that record could be sometime written, or it could be in different shape and different forms. It could be in the form of a film, it could be in the form of a book, it could be in the form of so many devices and so many formats to record history. Some people, they recorded history back in the caves through the cave paintings. So let's not so much be focused on the format or the media in which we write or record history, but focus on what is history and what it holds for us. Yes, these are past events, but what about the current events? As you might know, the current events would be pretty soon past events, and it might take whatever it takes, maybe the day's events that we have today, they would be down the road, 100 years old or 200 years old or 300 years old. As for us, you know, there is a history 500 BC and 5000 BC before Christ that we talk about in history. So today's events would be easily and pretty soon, you know, would be past events. So think about history, what it is and what it means to you personally. Now, history, think of it in another way. History as an event. For example, the First World War or the Second World War or the Cold War or any other major, you know, event. I just said, for example, World War II, a major event in the history, in the modern history of the world. No question about that. History as an event and then history as a narrative. These two make histories. Without one, the event, we would not have the narrative. And without the narrative, we would not know about the event itself. So when historians, they talk about history, they talk about mostly about history in two terms, as an event and as a narrative. Event like, you know, warfare, unfortunately, that's a major force in the making of history. And so the event being the war, all the mayhem and all the brutality that goes with it, that is also history, but we call it history as event. Now, we would not have known about all these wars, previous wars, past wars, wars that had been fought, you know, like whatever Alexander did, or even before that, before the birth of Christ. We would not have known about them if somebody had not written about them. So that's why it's very important, the writing about history or past events. If somebody says, you know, history is past events, at the same time history has to be recorded. And that is the reason both are very important. Without the record, without the book, without the knowledge, without the learning about those events, we would not have known them. And definitely there would not have been the recording or the writing or the narrative or the accounts of history if there were no events. But you should also know that in history there have been some strange things. For example, there have been events that were never recorded. And there were people made records of events that never happened. So that's another, you know, issue, made up, history being made up that did not happen, and yet, you know, people wrote about them as if they did happen. Also, when it comes to some personalities in history, they are controversial. Some people, you know, doubt if they really existed. I give you a very easy example, you know, and I'm not suggesting whether they did or did not exist. So just to tell you that there are controversies about some prominent personalities in history, like Shakespeare. In England, there are, you know, a lot of people who believe that there was no such person by that name, Shakespeare, and this was, you know, all made up person. So there are events that have happened in history but never recorded, but there were no events, and yet people recorded about them, wrote books about them, wrote accounts about them, and some, you know, we call them legends and whatever. We might call them by whatever terminology, but they did not happen. All they happen in books and in the imagination and in the minds of the people. So keep in mind history as event and history as narrative, and both are very important to know which one is significant for what purpose, the event as well as the narrative. Okay, an easy example would be when we mean the event, when we say history, and by that we mean the event itself, that is one thing. And when we say history, by which we mean a narrative, a book, that's another thing. So when we say a book of history about the Second World War, then we say a history of World War II. By a history, we mean an account, a narrative, a book. That could be also a movie about the Second World War. So that is when we say a history with the indefinite article a, by that we mean a book about history. And when we say the history, by that we mean the event itself, like the American War of Independence, you know, the making of United States, or all those events that went into the making of United States, we call them the history of the United States of America. But when we say a history of United States of America, by that we mean a book that was written about the events of United States of America. So one more time, a history is about the history. A history is the narrative, is the book about the events of United States of America. So a history is about the history. And without the history, we could never have a history. So without the event, we could never have the book. With that, sort of a discussion, let's move on to what is history. And with me, history is a story. And whenever you get up in the morning, you just say hi to it, and it would talk to you also. But if you think of history, you know, if I ask you what is history and you say it's a boring subject, you know, then definitely it's going to be boring for you. So what you should do is you welcome it. And that's why I call it history is basically hi plus story, and it is a story. No question about that. History is basically a story, and as individual people have their histories, as we say, you know, every person has a story. Similarly, every nation has a story. Whether recorded or not recorded, that's a different thing. But every person has a story, as in every nation, every country has a story. Meaning, every person has a history. Every family has its own family history. Where their forefathers came here, you know, or where did they go and what happened to them. All the, you know, the ups and downs that went into the making of that family would be called the family history. You could write your, you know, I bet each one of you can write, you know, your own family's histories, and you could write a big book about it. You just ask your parents or grandparents or whoever is there, you know, in the family, what happened to them, and they would tell you, you know, and so that's the personal history. Then a national history. Sometimes one person's history becomes a national history. So one person, very important person, and unfortunately at that time when he or she was around, nobody, you know, thought of them like big deal, but they did become, you know, very important personalities for their people. When it comes to history, also you should keep in mind that there are makers of history and there are writers of history. So some people make history and some people write about it. For an easy example would be Jesus. He made history. He did not write it himself. Moses, he made history. He did not write it itself. Another person would be Mahatma Gandhi. He not only made history but also wrote a lot about history, especially the one that he made. Similarly, Sir Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, he made history during Second World War, but at the same time he also wrote about those events. So there are makers of history and there are, you know, writers of history, and a lot of people just in between. Yeah, history is made for them. Or maybe sometime, you know, out of a good luck, somebody does something great and we all enjoy and the benefits of one person's, you know, doing. It could be a great invention. It could be just a great piece of wisdom they give us and we live by it, and, you know, like the Constitution of United States of America. Great minds, they sat together and wrote the Constitution of United States of America, and everybody now lives by it and, you know, reveres the writer of the constitutions, the makers of United States. And so that's one great thing. But sometime in history, you know, one single person does some stupid thing and some, you know, evil thing, and we all suffer. Millions and millions of people would suffer at the hands of one person or the actions of one person. So there are, you know, those problems in history. So whatever it is, history with me, it's a great story. So I encourage you that you should also look at history from a story point of view, as a personal story, family story, national story, or the story of a country. Now, geography and history has a lot to do with each other, and history is always made in a geographical location. So that's the reason I encourage you to look at history from a geographical point of view. How human beings, what they do locally to their geography, to their geographical, how they work out and how they live according to the geographical conditions of the place that they live in, and how they use the great geographical environment, or the great geographical wealth that they might have, environmental wealth, condition they might have. So that's why humanity plus geography, or geography plus humanity equals history. History is basically sort of a dialogue between human beings and their natural or environmental conditions in the geographical location that they live in. And I usually give an easy example that geography is the place that gives you food, geography is the place that gives you water, it gives you agricultural products, and as no two geographical locations are the same, that is why two different geographical locations would produce different food material, and they would produce different construction material, and that is the reason we eat different foods, we get used to it, we wear different clothes made of different products and yarn and threads, different material. We live in different architectural designs and structures. It's all because of their geographical conditions. So think about two persons, one living in somewhere in Alaska and another living somewhere in the Sahara. These are two very different places, Alaska is a desert of snow, the Sahara is a desert of sand. Alaska being very freezing place, and the Sahara being very hot, sizzling hot place. I tell my students that if you want to see how hot Sahara is, you just hold chicken to the sun, and then we would see who gets roasted first, you or the chicken. So it's a very hot place. Now think about the people who live in the Sahara and Alaska. Definitely they're going to be eating or using different material, different food stuff, because they do not produce the same food material. They would be using different material construction, different tools that they would use to make life livable in those harsh conditions. So that's why it's very important to think of history, our economy, the socioeconomic conditions, and even sometimes the political conditions in terms of geography. So geography has a big role to play in history. With me, especially with me, there are a lot of historians and geographers that would alert you and would encourage you to look at geography and history as interconnected. But with me, if history has any laws, geography is the first law of history. One more time. If history has any laws, geography is the first law of history, because history is the story of the socio-economic, the political, the civilization, the culture that we live in. And so that's why geography is very important. Now, keep in mind the geographical foundations of cultures, civilizations, and their stories, that is the histories of these places. So that's the reason to think deeply about the role of geography in humanity and the human history. Now, in some places, history started from very basic beginnings, and these very basic beginnings that we have about cultures and civilizations that is because of the nature or the differences in geography. As I said, two different geographical locations are bound to produce two different cultures and civilizations. So that's the reason you should be thinking about the geography. Now, let's see history and some of the different fields of history. History is not just one, field. It has a lot of aspects. It has a lot of fields. So the first and major, field of history is the political history, the political aspect of history. So that's we call it political history. Another would be the military history, history having so many warfares, and so many upheavals. So we call it military history. Another field would be the social history, or the social aspect of history. So when we talk about different fields, that's what we mean by. If someone says that he is or she is an expert in history, immediately we ask what type of a history: political history, military history, social history, or economic history. So that's why when we should be aware of the different fields of history. Now, just as history has so many fields, history has also a lot of periods, and history is made in different places. So that's why we say ancient India, India in ancient times, medieval India, that's another period. So there is the periodization in history: ancient India, medieval India, modern China, which is very different from ancient China. The same places, but different times, and so the difference of time makes a big difference in the history of that given place. 20th century of Japan, very different, compared to medieval Japan or ancient Japan. Similarly, think about it, we're a little bit ahead of our times. Post-communist China, China being now, since 1949, China is run by a communist party. It's a very totalitarian, state and government, communist China. But think of China without communism, as China was once without communism. There was no communism in China before 1949. But then, the Communist Party won big, and, they became predominant in China. And ever since 1949, China is being run by communism. Just as Soviet Union used to be a communist state, a totalitarian communist state, that state and that totalitarianism does not exist anymore. There is no more Soviet Union, and a lot of people got freedom when it collapsed. So Russia, which used to be, since 1917, it was a communist state, a communist country, communist government run by communism, but now it's without communism. So just as we can talk now of Russia without communism, I think we can also at least think, if we cannot talk about, at least we can think about China without communism. So that's why I brought in this post-communist China. And believe it or not, there are already people who, talking about the post-communist China. Now, there are in history sources of history. So we need to look at what are the sources of history and how history is written and on what basis. There are two major sources of history, one primary source and the other secondary source, both having their own values and their importance in the writing of history, in the sources of history. Maybe you should also think about what would be an example of a primary source or secondary source. So I really encourage you to think about these questions that definitely I would answer it, but at the same time, as we talk about these different things, think about the answers, and definitely you would have if you think. So let's see some of the primary sources and some of the secondary sources. Primary sources are documents or accounts written or narrated at the time when the events were taking place, or history was in the making, at that time. For example, the present war in Iraq. So that is, whatever we see or write and know about the war in Iraq, that is the primary source for us right now, because it's taking place and the events are unfolding. So whenever something is going on, like I'm sorry for giving you the example of a warfare, so that would be the different newspaper accounts, the different intelligence accounts, the different narratives that people would be writing, including, most importantly, including the letters that soldiers would be writing from Iraq to their families in the United States or in Germany or in France or different places in Europe or wherever. So the soldiers' accounts of what is happening or was happening at the time when they were part of that action. So that's also a big source, and that's why some nations, some countries, they keep a close eye what the soldiers are writing back home, because they can divulge the real account, the truth as they see it, as they participate in it. So that's why these are very important. Intelligence reports, of course everybody does not have access to them at the time when these events are happening or were happening. Later on we can look at these reports when the states and the governments or the agencies allow us. So primary documents, or those documents or accounts that were written at the time when the event was happening. So that's the primary source. Now let us look at the secondary source. One more example of the primary source though would be the newspaper, and the media accounts. CNN or whoever is giving you, and whatever you are listening to, that would be the primary sources. Newspapers, as I said, media accounts, memoirs or intelligence reports. Secondary sources would be things like documents or accounts that were written later on the basis of the primary sources. And sometimes secondary sources could just put together other secondary sources and they analyze these secondary sources. So secondary sources are written after the event. It could be 100 years or 200 years or whatever number of years later, when some account is written about an event that was past event, that's called a secondary source. When the history or the event was in the making and unfolding, that was that is the primary source about that time, about that personality. Another easy example would be, think about the life of Christ as he was living, when he was there, preaching and teaching people and bringing people to the worship of one God. And so although he did not write about himself, although he did not write about the conditions, the social, economic, political conditions that he was part of and teaching and living, but other people did. So whoever saw or met or heard, and watched Christ, whatever he was doing, that would be our primary resource. And that is the reason for not just only religious events, but for a lot of political events and socio-economic events, Bible is used as a primary source of history, primary source for those times in which the events happened about which Bible talks. Similarly, not just only Bible, the Old Testament or the New Testament, but also in other religious traditions, like in the Hindu scriptures, there are a lot of events that happen. And the Hindu scriptures talk about, different, numerous events, warfare events, love affairs, and these events, we don't know much about them, but we know something about them, and that is on the basis of what the Hindu scriptures tell us. So these are the religious scriptures, whether these are Hindu or Jewish or Christian or Islamic. These scriptures are used as primary sources. Now, the secondary sources would be those, about, as I said, that are written and talked about later. Let's go into the birth of humanity, especially in the context of, the world, and then from there we would get into the humanity as it started in Asia. So let's see the birth of humanity. Bible, it talks about, how human beings were created, and that structure or that format, we call it creationism or Genesis. So Bible gives us the story of how human beings came about. It's the story of Adam and Eve, and from those two persons how the rest of humanity started. Now when it comes to creationism or Genesis, you should know that Bible is not the only book that gives us insights about creationism or Genesis. Almost every civilization, Jewish, non-Jewish, Christian, non-Christian, Muslim, Hindu or Chinese, they give us their own accounts of Genesis. So almost every civilization, every culture has its own accounts of how human beings started in the places where they live and they are familiar with. So the story in Genesis or the creation is not the only one. Different religions, different regions and different races and people, ethnicities have their own accounts how humanity started. So we would talk about not so much in terms of Bible in Asia. We know something about the Genesis through Bible, but our focus would primarily based on archaeology and history and archaeological instruments, weapons or tools that we found, and how human beings, they started life in different parts of Asia. Okay, now there's another sort of a source for us about the birth of humanity, and that is science, and how science treats or talks about the the rise of humanity or the birth of humanity, and we call it evolution, or sometimes Darwinism, known after Charles Darwin, the British biologist. So Bible talks about, and it gives us its own sense and its own view of the birth of humanity through Genesis. Science gives us the theory of evolution and Darwinism. So I'm not suggesting one or the other. What I'm saying, you should know about both sources. Being an educated person, we should know something about the religious, and not just one religious group, how human beings started. We should know other stories of Genesis through the Hindu or the Chinese, or for that reason the Judeo-Christian and Islamic view of humanity. That is the religious way to go by. Another one is the scientific, through Darwinism, or for that reason through the story or the theory of evolution. As I said, I'm not suggesting one or the other. We should know both, and that's how educated people should deal with the matter. Although one belongs to belief and faith, and the other belongs to matter of fact, science, that we can take it to a chemical lab and test them. So these are two different fields, but still we should know more about them. All right. When it comes to the birth of humanity, we would see how human beings started. Human creatures like us, so to speak, from Africa, and that's the sort of theory, scientific theory, Darwinist or evolutionist theory that we know about, how human beings started from northeastern African ridges and how they spread to different places somewhere around 3 to 5 million years ago. So that's Africa is considered to be the birthplace of humanity, and after from that place how they got and where did they go. Somewhere around 1 to 2 million years ago, tool using Homo erectus people, that we call them Homo erectus because they were standing on 2 legs as compared to the rest of the animals who were standing or working on 4. So how the tool using Homo erectus people, they used and how they made life possible for them somewhere around 1 to 2 million years ago. And again, how they spread out from Africa into primarily Asia, and where did they go and where they found the places, the civilizations and the cultures. So that's what we would also be talking about. Then the next segment would be the Homo sapiens. These are considered to be people just like us, maybe we are a little bit smarter because we are living in the age of internet. That could be the reason. So that's about 200 years, 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, they lived. And they lived not only just in Africa, but in different parts of the world, especially in Asia. So that is east of Africa. They, spread out and started life. So that's another major group. And then exactly human beings like us, that is 100,000 years ago, they went, and the places that now we see we find them, those are the places where they, lived. So we will deal with different stages of human evolution and the places that they made homes. And let's see, where you see now is Africa basically, and how the early human beings spread out of Africa, and mostly they went first and foremost primarily in Asia, and that is Southwest Asia, that is the Middle East. So they starting from northeastern Africa and spread primarily into Asia and some into modern day Turkey, and from there into Europe. So that's the reason Africa is considered to be the birthplace of human beings, and that's the cradle of humanity. And that's why, for in one or another way, almost every human being is African by origin. So, and that we take it like it's a some people debate that theory, but it's a well established theory that human beings, whoever we are and wherever we are basically Africans by birth and by origin. Okay, let's move on from the Africa, how early human beings, they produced early cultures in different places that they did, different cultures based on different geographical locations. And the as I said in the beginning, what is culture and what is civilization, we will talk about that a little bit. What are some of the differences and some of the similarities in the two terminologies that we use. Culture is basically the first stage upon which later on a civilization is built. So let's think of culture as the first stage, the basic, the foundation upon which a civilization is built. Also, for a civilization to be there, it means that there has to be first a culture. Now, that could be not true of many civilizations, although so far as a rule is concerned, all civilizations are based on primary cultures. So these civilizations primarily they were cultures, and later on they developed into civilizations. But there are civilizations that were not dependent upon one or another culture. They are the product of many cultures. Some people use a very ancient model like that of Mesopotamia, being a civilization that was made out of different cultures, the cultures of Babylonians, the culture of Hittites, the culture of Akkadians, or the culture of Persians. So different cultures went into the making of that first civilization that we call the Mesopotamian civilization, which was in the modern day, country of Iraq. Then there is the latest culture, the brand new latest culture, which is also likened to the ancient civilization of Mesopotamia or modern day Iraq. That is the United States, which is not really based on one given culture, although primarily it was based on the European culture, the British or the Englishmen who were here, or for that reason Europeans, Germans and others that came here, and Irish people that came here. But later on it also is based on the people that were not Europeans but came to United States. And that's why when you look at the American civilization, it is not just one culture. It is made out of a lot of cultures. You name it, and they are there. Their food, their clothes, their languages, their traditions, their beliefs, their religions, their mosques, all of them are here in the United States. So when we say the American civilization, although primarily European civilization and Christian civilization, but underneath it has different religions, it has different races, different ethnicities, and different languages that we see throughout the United States. So a culture for a civilization, it does not have to be based on just one culture, but that's the original scheme of things. The original scheme was that for a civilization to be there, there has to be a culture first. So think of a culture as the first stage, and civilization is the second or the higher stage which is built upon culture. So culture is the foundation, and civilization is the superstructure upon which we make it. Culture is, as I said, foundation, and civilization is the structure, the upper structure that we see. So again, culture is very much based on geography. It is very dependent upon the geographical conditions, the local environment, and the natural resources that it utilizes. So when it comes to culture, it basically is geography, upon which we make our life livable or sustainable. So culture is dependent upon local geography. Think of that and see, think of different geographical conditions that have produced different cultures. And that's the question, why so many cultures are different? Well, the reason is that these cultures were made in different geographical regions and different geographical, upon different natural and geographical environmental resources. Culture, since is very physical, that's why it's making things to make life livable, or to satisfy the two basic needs of human beings, which are food and shelter. So whenever human beings, they satisfy their two basic needs of food and shelter, how to live, through eating, and how to protect ourselves in the different structures that we might have. Some might have caves, some might have, huts to live in. So whatever the nature of our shelters, the places where we live in, and the food we eat, that is basically dependent upon the geographical conditions, the environmental conditions that we live in. So that's the reason culture is very geographic specific. Now let's move on into the culture, how it is to making things, where civilization is to thinking things. Civilization is very refined. At the level of civilization, we do not worry how to get our next meal or how to make our hut or, you know, structure. So that's why civilization is to thinking things. Culture is to muscles, you know, power, muscular power, and to hands. Civilization is to mind and to head. At the level of civilization, we use a lot of mind, although we use also at the level of culture, but culture is very physical, civilization is very mental exercise. Another sort of you know, difference between the two would be, at the level of culture we do not influence people that much, but civilization is very much a force of influence. It is a force of control, military control, economic, political or religious control. So think of culture. When you are confined to your own self, or when you are with your own self, but when you get out of your geographical area or your, you know, race or ethnic area, and when you bring other nations or that particular culture that we're talking about, brings other nations under its military control, economic control, social or political or religious control, that control makes the culture into a civilization. And I use, you know, a strong word, control. It's a big term, control. However, we can also use influence. So whenever a culture influences other cultures and bring them under its influences, that culture is on its way to become a civilization. Now, there are a lot of cultures who did not influence other cultures, and that's why they are left at the level of culture. There's nothing wrong with it. You know, some cultures become civilizations because they are forced to become civilizations. Because if they had not become civilization, they would have been eaten up or drowned by other cultures. So that is why it's very important to know how a civilization became a civilization after being beaten up and after being, you know, opposed and after being, you know, sort of bullied around. Some civilizations, they became civilization after a lot of negative forces that worked upon them, and so they built resistance against other civilizations and other cultures, and they refused to go down. You know, in history they refused to stay, they refused to go down, and they built up their own resistance power, and they stood up to these higher or bigger forces, and that's how civilizations work. So culture is very local, civilization is huge and big. Another way of making a civilization is that civilization can be sometime a matter of even religion. Different ethnicities, different cultures that belong to different geographical locations, they can combine under the influence of a religion. They can combine and make one big civilization. A primary, example would be that of a Christian civilization, in which you have Russians as Greek Orthodox, in which you would have, Americans primarily, non-Catholic, or Germans, Lutherans, or for that reason, Spanish or French Catholic, and yet we talk of them as a Christian civilization. Or for that reason, even getting out of the, the geographic area of Europe and going into Asia, like Philippines, it's a predominantly Catholic nation. So, because of the Catholic or the Christian bonds, it does belong to the Christian civilization, and that's, a big connection and big affinity that it has with Spain, or for that reason Portugal, or, with Europe. Similarly, Islam, that's a civilization which contains different cultures, different languages, different geographical locations, and which is a very universal civilization, Islamic civilization. Think about, the cultures or the Muslims in China, or the Muslims in Mindanao, that is in the south of Philippines, or the Muslims in, Arabia, the Middle East, or the Muslims in Europe and the Muslims in the United States. They may not have anything in common. They speak different languages. They belong to different ethnic groups. They eat, they have different food liking or preferences, and yet they belong to a bigger umbrella of the Islamic civilization. So that is how different cultures, become under one big civilization. It could be a Christian civilization, a Jewish civilization, Islamic civilization, and sometimes it could be based on a region where you would have different cultures like the Russian culture, the Spanish culture, the German culture, or the English culture, and yet we can bring them and talk about them in terms of a European culture. So that's the function of how cultures, are made into how they are made into civilizations. Now, the birth of civilization itself, there are quite a few stages, but primarily two major stages: the Paleolithic stage, or the Old Stone Age, that started, somewhere between 1 million years and 100,000 BC. It's a huge big period in which people, human beings used stones and stone implements, tools, they used them. The humans, they were just like, living the rest of the animal world by getting their food through hunting and gathering. That is, a huge big time period. And through these hunting and gathering expeditions, they satisfied their biological needs of food and shelter. So human beings, they were just doing, what like other animals were doing. Now, the next stage in history is that of the Neolithic stage, which is called the New Stone Age, that ran from 10,000 to 8,000 BC, before Christ. That's how I use the time period in my classes. So get used to it, and that's how I encourage you also to keep it simple, BC and AD. The rise of agriculture and settled life that you see during this period, which are also called the Neolithic settlements, which these Neolithic settlements that got up in different places, and not everywhere though. And why not everywhere? Because, well, that's the question you need to answer. And not everywhere because they were, everywhere water was not available. That's the reason. So wherever you have a major source of water like a river, there you would have a major culture or major civilization. So earliest cultures developed into earliest civilizations like ancient Mesopotamia of Iraq, Egypt, India, and China. The river valley civilization, these are called the river valley civilizations. So keep again the importance of geography, water, soil, good environment, and human, that were good for human survival. In conclusion, I just want to remind you what we talked about. Basically, we talked about the different geographical regions of Asia, the definition of history, what makes history, what is a history and what is the history. We also talked about how history works through time and space, like ancient history or the history of ancient China or ancient India or modern Japan or communist China or non-communist China. We also talked about the origins of humanity, human beings, how human beings started, how cultures, they arose, and how these cultures become civilizations. So the rise of culture and the rise of civilizations. And also we need to think of history, especially history in the sense of early civilizations, more in terms of geography. So I really encourage you to, when we talk about Asian civilizations, think of the local geographical conditions which produce these civilizations, like the geography of China, the geography of India, or for that reason Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So I encourage you to think of geography first, the geographical locations. Number two, I would encourage you to see how naturally people, they started their life based on whatever was available naturally, whatever a place could grow in terms of food or in terms of the construction material. So that's why I encourage you to look at geography, the geographical resources, also the geographical forces that some people, had to deal with, and how they protected themselves. So one more time, geography, very important, and please, another thing that, as I said in the beginning of today's session, was that go to WebCT under my name and under History 241, and please watch for the course assignments, the housekeeping, what is due and what is not, on a weekly or sort of monthly basis. So one more time, please have a good look at the syllabus, the course outline, the different requirements, and when would be each session. And it tells you, the course outline tells you what we would be doing in each session. So that's very important, for you to print out the course outline and look at the assignments. There would be some sort of tests on WebCT, and there would be written assignments. So that's why it's very important for you to print out and keep up with the schedule. And thank you very much, and we will continue the exciting history of Asian civilizations, History 241. Thank you very much for having me.